There is a sliver of time, a handful of years, that produced a kind of person the world still doesn't quite have a word for. You know who you are because you remember the ritual of rewinding a rented VHS, not just hitting play, and also remember the exact afternoon you ripped your first CD to a hard drive. You're not someone who only knows streaming. You're not someone who missed cassettes entirely. You were there in the middle, as the ground changed beneath your feet, right when you were still trying to figure out who you were supposed to be. If your birth year falls somewhere in the late 70s to the mid-80s, say 1976 to 1985, you belong to a microgeneration that psychologists and sociologists spent decades debating. For a long time, they didn't know what to make of you. You were too young for one label, too old for the next. Then, around 2014, a researcher named Sarah Stonner gave this group a name, xennials. She placed them between the late 70s and the early 80s, a small pocket of time wedged between the cynicism of Gen X and the digital optimism of millennials. Some researchers call you the Oregon Trail generation, after that old computer game where you had to manage resources, ford rivers, and survive the journey with what little you had. It's a surprisingly accurate metaphor, not because it was just a game, but because it captures a specific skill, navigating uncertain terrain with limited supplies, figuring out the next move as you went along. Most generational labels are broad strokes, spanning 15 or 20 years, but this microgeneration is barely 8 or 9 years wide. It's not a generational cohort in the usual sense. It's a pinpoint, a very specific moment in history. What happened in that narrow window that left such a distinct mark on you, a mark that broader categories like Gen X and millennials fail to explain. It's not about being exceptional, it's about timing. Consider what daily life was like before the digital age fully arrived. You remember passing handwritten notes in class, folded into precise triangles, knowing they could be confiscated if a teacher saw. You made plans to meet a friend at a specific street corner at a specific hour, and then you simply went there and waited. There was no way to know if they were running late. You either showed up or you didn't. And people remembered which one you were. If you missed an episode of your favorite show, it was gone. You had to rely on a friend to describe it to you the next day, filling in the gaps with your own imagination. And the mistakes you made, the awkward comment at a party, the embarrassing phase you went through in middle school, they faded. Nobody had a camera phone. Nobody archived it. It lived in a few people's memories, softening over time, the way memories are supposed to when nothing is constantly refreshing them. Your brain was designed to let things shift, keep what mattered, and release what didn't. Growing up in that analog world allowed your childhood to become a story you told, not a permanent digital record you had to live inside forever. Then, just as you were entering your late teens and early 20s, the world turned upside down. It wasn't a slow evolution, it was an explosion. Email, mobile phones, the sudden whoosh of a broadband connection, MySpace, it all arrived within a few short years. The world you grew up in essentially vanished, and a completely new one emerged in its place. Research published in Nature Neuroscience shows that the part of our brain responsible for adapting to new systems remains highly flexible until about age 25. You hit that developmental window at the exact moment the digital revolution exploded. You were old enough to remember what came before, yet young enough that your brain was still open to what replaced it. This is the defining feature. Gen Xers had to learn the internet later in life, like an adult learning a second language, functional, maybe even fluent, but rarely effortless. Younger millennials and Gen Z were born into it. For them, the internet isn't a tool they learned, it's the very atmosphere they breathe. You are the only generation that holds both worlds natively. You remember what it felt like to leave the house and be truly unreachable for hours, and yet you navigate a dozen different messaging apps without a second thought. But is this dual fluency purely an advantage, or is there a cost to being the bridge between two eras? There's a less discussed part of this story. Your entry into the job market coincided with the dot-com crash of the early 2000s. First jobs, first apartments, that first attempt at building a life, and the floor fell out. You rebuilt slowly and carefully. And just as you were reaching a point of stability, 2008 hit. Economists call this a scarring effect. Economic instability during your formative career years leaves a mark that doesn't simply vanish when the economy recovers. It shows up in the small, quiet decisions you make decades later. The emergency fund that never feels quite big enough. The backup plan you keep in your back pocket even when everything seems fine. The slight hesitation before committing to something permanent. That's not just anxiety. It's closer to muscle memory. Your body remembers something your mind has already moved past. If you've ever felt that underlying hesitation and never knew where it came from, that's where, and it leads to another subtle pattern. You often end up as the translator in the room. the person who can bridge the gap between older colleagues who want hierarchy and process and younger ones who demand speed and autonomy. You speak the language of both. But being the person who bridges every gap means you're constantly absorbing the friction between two sides. You make things work, you smooth things over, but rarely does anyone ask what that constant mediation costs you. Psychologists call this emotional labor. For those who carry it habitually, it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like the default state of things. It becomes invisible to you. If you've spent years being the reliable one, the one who holds things together, and you've felt a quiet tiredness underneath that you could never quite locate, that's not a personality flaw. That's what it costs to hold the line for a long time without ever putting the weight down. So let's return to that VHS tape for a moment. The person who meticulously rewound it before returning it, and then figured out MP3s just a few years later, wasn't adaptable because of some inherent superpower. They adapted because they had to. The world changed, and they changed with it, without losing the person they were before. You watched a world end. There was no announcement, no clear boundary line. It just ended slowly and then all at once, the way things do when you're not watching them directly. And then you watched another one begin. You were old enough to know what was being left behind, and young enough to step into what came next without getting stuck at the border. Most people get to live in one world. You got the seam, the exact place where one version of human life stitched into a completely different one. And you learned, not through a lesson, but simply by living, that who you are is not determined by the world you started in. In an era where the ground is constantly shifting for everyone, the people who have already practiced landing on their feet, without losing track of where they came from, carry something invaluable. It can't really be taught. It can only be lived, and if you lived it, you carry it with you right now. If this resonated with you, drop a like for Winds of Thought and let us know in the comments. What's one piece of your analog childhood you still carry with you today?